Mohon perhatian kepada para pelajar atau penyokong dan peserta.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we are about to begin, we would like to request for your kind assistance to switch your mobile phone to silent mode to ensure the smooth flow of today's event. Please rise during the arrival of our guest of honor, which is preceded by the national anthem and wawasanku. Thank you for your kind cooperation and attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, the procession of the championship trophy of the Royal Malaysian InterVarsity Debating Championship. The Honourable Associate Professor Dr. Zulkifli Hassan, Deputy Rector, Student Development and Community Engagement, International Islamic University Malaysia, IIUM, comes the Chairman of Majlis Debat University Malaysia, MADUM, the Honourable Professor Insigne Technologist Dr. Haji Rezwan Haji Kamaruddin, Deputy Vice Chancellor of Academic and International, University Malaysia Perlis UNIMAP, Acting Vice Chancellor, the Honourable Dr. Zaid Omar, Director of Holistic Student Division, Ministry of Education Malaysia, the Honourable Associate Professor Dr. Muzamil Juso, Dean of Student Affairs and Alumni Department, UNIMAP.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam ilmu keikhlasan kecemerlangan UNIMAP. #Love, Happiness, and Mutual Respect. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the Royal Malaysian InterVarsity Debating Championship. On behalf of organizer, we would like to express our appreciation to our entire guests for attending this event, and a very warm welcome to the honorable guests, participants and members of the hall to University Malaysia Perlis UNIMAP. For your information, the 4 days competition held at UNIMAP Powerputra main campus started from 5th to 9th September 2019, and we are very amazed and seeing 24 universities from Perlis to Sabah took part in this competition for both English and Bahasa category. Give a big round of applause to all of you.
Members of the hall, before we start, we would like to invite our honourable speaker for the of the Royal Malaysian InterVarsity Debating Championship, Mr. Zamir Hamdi Hamdan, Assistant Vice President, Human Capital Astro Malaysia Holdings Berhad, who was also the champion of Royal Malaysian InterVarsity Debating Championship 2007. Please, the floor is yours, Mr. Zamir.
Thank you, Mashita and Aiman. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the grand finals of the Royal Malaysian InterVarsity Debating Championship. Tepuk. You are quite right, I'm a bit aged. The last time I was on stage was in 2007. That's about more than 10 years ago. Many things has changed. Good debating, fortunately, has not. Before we start the debate, I'd like to introduce the panel of adjudicators. There will be 5 of them who will be adjudicating the grand finals this morning. The panel will be headed by Albert Kamalendra from Intertext Solutions. We also have Farhan Shah from UTP, Amy Sohana from Unimas, Edwin Tan from BAC, and Lim Tai Jay from Monash, Malaysia. Next, I'd like to introduce the debaters who has made it to the grand finals. Representing the government bench is the team from the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Speaking first is Umay Marshita Muhammad Azhar. Second will be Muhammad Hilmi Muhammad Yazid. The third speaker is Irtiza Ali Somro. And we also have the reserve speaker, Shafia Azan. On the opposition bench, we have the team from University Malaya. The first speaker would be Nevin Venudran. Second is Danesh Ram Agarwal. The third is Sharwin Muhammad Mohan. And last but never least, the reserve speaker is Mishalini Nagalingam. The motion that will be debated this morning is, this House prefers a Malaysia with a singular national identity as opposed to a multicultural identity. Without any more delay, let's invite the Prime Minister to start the debate. Please welcome.
Testing. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. A multicultural identity has polarized our Malaysian society. It has allowed for political divisiveness, justified economic disenfranchisement towards minorities, and promoted social unrest. Our goal in the government team is to prove that in a world where we have a singular national identity, we would be able to better promote an equal society in status quo. Because it's a prefers debate, we'll have to travel back in time to see what the narrative would be like in a world where we had done this to begin with. So what does that necessarily look like? I think that we would want a Malaysian race within status quo, and we think that we would just have everyone have one national identity. So this looks like maybe giving up the negotiations of having Malay privileges during the era of the time of Tunku Abdul Rahman's negotiation. This also looks like removal of a race from the IC, and we think that this is because races are not necessarily contingent upon religion. I think this means that we would have better integration and assimilation within status quo and better interaction between all races, right? So what does our status quo necessarily look like? I think in status quo there are different tiers within society that only privileges certain amount of races. So when we're talking about the Bumiputra policy that gives us benefits such as Malays working within government, becoming government officials, or having special rates of housing, or having special land, etc., these are things that obviously divided our society within status quo. I'll take you at 6. So this also means and looks like Malays given things like constitutional protection. I think that the perception on the ground currently is that these other races aren't necessarily as important, and I think that the outcome of that is that there's a lot of social divisiveness, which has a lot of practical outcomes. I think just on that basis, when we're talking about a lot of other races feeling like we're out to get them, they're more likely to collectivize and be in enclaves and supporting one another instead. That is why when we're looking at the workplace, a lot of the times Chinese companies would prioritize their own race, or Indian firms are more likely to prioritize their own race when it comes to promotion, hiring, etc. And we think that those things are necessarily harmful. The conclusion of this analysis is that you have more enclaves created than status quo, and there is a lack of interaction within minorities. What are my two main arguments? questions. The first is, how do we then create a better equal world? And why is it harmful for us to have a multiracial identity? On this first basis, what happens during the formation of Malaysia? I think that in a world where we would have only one single national identity, we would have better equal rights within status quo. So this looks like, for example, having only public schools, so there are no vernacular schools that teach us that only one race is necessarily more important than the other. We would not have things like special land for Malays that only allow for the economic protection of Malays and not the economic protection of a lot of Indian minorities. That's why when you see a lot of races within different states, like Indians who currently live in Penang, they're more likely to be less economically empowered within that particular region because of the protection that we give towards the Malay majority. The conclusion of this particular analysis is that at the point in time where we have a lot of division, when it comes to social division or social interaction within status quo, you can never have the best form of assimilation, right? So then I think that oftentimes religion also influences these particular things, and religion is also influenced by things like culture, because if you noticed that the rise of Islamicism only started off post the era of Anwar Ibrahim or post the formation of certain political parties, right? And at that point in time previously, we had a lot of cross-racial marriages, we had a lot of an ability to accept different cultures, we had Muslims who were more likely going to interact with these other individuals in comparison to a world now where multiculturalism has festered into individuals only thinking that their races are ones that should be prioritized within status quo. I'll talk about this on a political level and then on an economic level, but before that, I'll take any points of information.
Yes, social divisiveness would have been at a greater magnitude if all the contributions of the other cultures when we gain independence. Why is it right to lock them out at the very beginning?
I think that the contributions would still be recognized within status quo. Knowing that you're a Malaysian, you're more likely to be recognized rather than just prioritizing the history of Malays within status quo that currently happens, right? So let's move on. Why are all interactions necessarily not going to result in things like conflict? I think because of the interactions that you're more likely to have, or the fact that you would also collectivize the kind of policies that you would have. I think that would be a lot better. Why is it harmful? And this is entering my second argument in terms of having a more multiracial society. I think that currently within status quo, there are a lot of conflicts that exist because of race. We have a creation of echo chambers because of societies decide they only want to interact among themselves. I think that things like race-based protection have been a justification to ignore the plights of other minorities. And it creates a perception of us versus them mentality, especially when it comes to things like workplace politics, where the promotions are more likely going to prioritize your own race. How about this on a political level? Because I think that this is a huge aspect of the debate. Because when there is an existence of multicultural societies, there obviously is more of an ability for you to play on things like race-based politics. So when we're talking about institutions like UMNO, MCA, or MIC, they've become consistently more polarized as the election cycle consistently happens, right? So we're talking about race as a tool to garner power. Race is a tool of relatability, saying that Malays are more likely going to be benefited if they supported our political party because Chinese individuals are only going to care about themselves. This creates a cycle of things like fear-mongering that makes race become a political tool. But it's not just that, but I think that other extreme more political parties like PAS, etc., are more likely to ignite more conflict and divisiveness when they see that this is something that prioritizes them. When we're talking about, for example, the instance of the issue of Adit being murdered by a group of Indian individuals, this was used as a political narrative by a lot of political parties. Or the fact that when they were also using tools such as saying that Malays are individuals who should be prioritized in status quo, this encourages more political divisiveness within status quo. Why is it likely that this won't change? Because they might say that you might moderate in the future. Firstly, I think it's because a lot of Malay individuals grew up with the benefits of the Bumiputra policy. They think that this is something that has benefited us for generations, therefore they are less likely to involve themselves in political discourse that benefits a vast majority of individuals because this is something that they are prioritized. The quality of their life is based on this particular Bumiputra policy, and it has shaped their narrative of generations of thinking that this is the only means of them for empowerment. For all of those reasons, if you think that political discourse is more likely going to be polarized and economic disenfranchisement is more likely to happen in a world where you have a multicultural identity, go with side government. Thank you.
Thank you, Umai. A strong and brave proposal from a lady Prime Minister. Perhaps Malaysia is ready for a lady Prime Minister, or perhaps a lady Prime Minister is what Malaysia needs. But hold on, we have not heard what the opposition has to say. And to start the ball rolling on the opposition's stance, let's invite the Leader of Opposition, Nevin.
Testing. I love equality and unity as much as the next person. But this debate needs to understand that Malaysia has evolved as a nation that got independence, which is exactly the reason why this debate cannot necessarily come in a retrospective reason. The reason for this is because we need to acknowledge how exactly Malaysia got its independence in the first place. Understand that the reason in which how we actually got independence was through the tolerance of the representation from different leaders of a particular race. Understand that if we even want to apply it retrospectively, would we then have gotten independence? Because understand that at that particular time, racial tensions were at a particular high. Umai saying that now the racial tensions are particularly high now means that even back then, what exactly were the incentives for UMNO then to allow the independence to happen in the first place if there were to be a singular identity? Secondly, let's understand that this was the particular reason why Tun Jaafar was kicked out of UMNO in the first place, because he wanted the idea of a unity among different forms of races, which was the reason why they changed the governance of UMNO in and of itself, meaning that this debate must take place in a perspective of what exactly happens now in Malaysia, what exactly should continue, and what exactly will be the outcomes of it. Two rebuttals, Two rebuttals to the Prime Minister's speech. Number one, I don't think that her benefits are necessarily exclusive to their side. I think they're mutually exclusive because they talked about how this social decidement is bad. Understand, when Umai talks to you about public schools, this was a particular reason or a bargaining tool that the Chinese and the Indians used in order to necessarily say they will agree to necessarily come accord with UMNO, which is why they wanted the protection of vernacular schools, which is why vernacular schools are protected by a constitution. This itself proves how exactly vernacular schools and the importance of protection of culture such as language was something that the Chinese and Indians wanted and why it was then written into the constitution. But the third question, I think why government case falls, is because they fail to tell you what exactly does this national identity look like. I think it's easy for us now to look that the national identity will look good now because everything is well and done, but understand what exactly, who would have dictated this if we were to take their world. If we were to debate in their world where it happened retrospectively, more oftentimes than not, the minorities, which were the Chinese and the Indians, would not have their representation within this identity, meaning that the identity will be far led by the Malays, meaning that the Chinese culture and Indian culture would more likely be diminished or pushed down because of the high demographic of Malays that existed and the high inequality that we did not have now. And later I'll talk to you why this then is not true, even if this debate happens now. But sure.
In a world where you don't have race as a priority, wouldn't you also create economic policies that benefited every single race rather than have, for example, special protection land for only certain Malays?
Okay, so here's two things here. Number one, you would not have gotten that in the past, but secondly, this leads me into my two arguments, because I'm going to tell you two things in my speech. Number one, I'm going to tell you how exactly culture does not necessarily divide you and why we can live in a multicultural world and still will live with your economical benefits. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why culture is important to them, why we should preserve it. And thirdly, and how I'm going to tell you it's counterproductive to this. But firstly, let's understand some context here, because we need to understand that if we were to apply this rule now, what exactly would happen? Malaysia is currently seeded, or we currently have an imbalance of rights, meaning that Bhumiputra rights are still protected, meaning that we have a demographic which are 60% Malay, 30% Chinese, and 7% Indians. Understand that we still have a country where Islam is the main, or rather the main religion of stating here. So what exactly is the single identity that is more likely to happen? Understand that the case that's going to happen is that there will not be a true representation of culture, meaning that people's culture will somehow be compromised. Even if side government wants to believe in a world where there's a compromise between cultures, oftentimes than not, it will lead to the majority. Second thing, what does the multicultural look like? What does side opposition want to defend? We want to defend status quo, where each culture or each race is able to live in our own enclaves, or still be able to practice our religions with the form of respect. First argumentation, why exactly culture does not divide us? Because understanding the historical context on how exactly our constitution is built upon the premise that everybody should have the right to practice this equally. Let's understand what exactly happens in the status quo. Understand that different races take pride in their culture. We can see this through language, traditions, celebration, and religious ties to this cultural stuff. Meaning that each particular race places a high burden or high importance on this culture being there. Meaning that we want this form of multiculturalism because it's what makes Malaysia, Malaysia. It's our ability to naturally identify the different strengths and imbalances between each culture and then use it for our own self. Understand that we have been living like this for 60 years, and to change this now will be counterproductive. Secondly, understand that people have built their lives upon their culture, meaning that we see that schools, communities, NGOs, and even political parties which are racially based prove that that race and culture plays a part in how exactly we live our lives, how exactly we live up in our particular communities. What does this prove, and what is the conclusion of this argument? The conclusion of this argument is that status quo is fine. The reason for this is because we understand that we acknowledge the free space of different races. The reason for this is because in the status quo, different races have the autonomy to decide how they want to do their things. When you have a singular identity, you'll have different races dictating which culture should be placed now. When you have a single, let's say you have an event, which culture is then supposed to be portraying the Malaysian culture? When we have different races controlling their own culture, the autonomy gives them the ability to have that form of independence, to have the form of satisfaction that you are able to control your culture and still be Malaysian in your forms of identity. Side governments told you who exactly will be controlling this identity and why this will be beneficial to all then. No thank you. Secondly, my second argument on how this will be counterproductive to racial harmony. Understand that within the status quo, the biggest tension that the minorities of the Indians and Chinese have is the fact that we don't have equal rights. So understand this. The reason why the Chinese and Indian communities are okay with this unequal right now is because we're able to then support our own communities. Meaning that because we have private schools, because we have communities which support each other, the very fact that there are equal rights establish or gives us the legitimization to then pump money into Chinese schools, to pump money into our own communities, to pump money into different forms of NGOs because the government, or rather the nation, does not support equal rights. Understand that when you want to then acknowledge a single identity without rectifying equal rights first, there will be high backlash. I think this is something they have to deal with because the community will be highly angry or pissed off because of the very fact that the reason is now you'll be living under a single identity, but you have different enclaves of ethnicities getting different benefits, meaning that you will still have Malays having special educational rights, you'll have better Amanah Saham returns, and you will not be able to reach the true Malaysian identity because everyone will be living in a toxic environment where you will not be living but on an equal basis with the person next to you. In conclusion, what did side opposition tell you? We told you how exactly Malaysia has been living perfectly, and we have had previous large steps of democracy, how we've seen that even DAP now can compromise itself to come together to take down a corrupt government, to show that when a nation comes together of different multiculturalism, we can achieve a form of unity, we can respect each other's identity and still continue to be as one particular national identity. We don't necessarily see why we need to compromise this, we don't necessarily see how people be okay with this, and we believe that Malaysia is on a good road. We want to support it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nevin. I hope our politicians, especially opposition politicians, are watching this debate because they most certainly can learn a few things from debaters on the floor. Yes, spices here and there to make things a bit more lively. To continue the debate on the government bench, let's hear it from the second speaker, Itiza. Sorry, second speaker is Hilmi Yazid.
Hello, testing. When I was in primary school, I had an Indian friend. In one of the classes, we tried to do this thing where we wanted to bring food and had a potluck. That one Indian friend bought beef, I think, so-called, like my memory tries to remember. And I still remember clearly when my classmates say that we will not eat your beef because you are not one of us. I can see and I remember the eyes of my friend in disbelief when the point in time where he wanted to try and assimilate, he couldn't because we thought that he wasn't one of us. To this very day, that memory haunts me and I regretted that from ever happening. In a world in which you attempt to create a singular identity, you do not prioritize other people as others, but rather one of us. You don't think that they are different. You think that or in best case scenario, you attempt to assimilate in most instances. There are two questions I want to ask in this particular debate, and I'll answer them as to why government wins. Number one, what would the world in which you create a singular identity look like? The process to which we achieve that singular identity, and whether or not that world, in comparison to the opposition's world of status quo, is more preferable in terms of whether or not it's more harmonious, whether or not conflicts are less, and whether or not social integration and our ability to assimilate with other groups are better off. First point, what does our world look like? We got a contention coming from opposition to suggest that in the formation of Malaysia, you will not achieve independence. Look, this debate is not about whether or not we achieved independence, but rather to the point in time where we already have achieved independence, how do you want to move forward from there? So hence, contention when it comes to whether or not we will achieve Merdeka is not an issue. It's about post-Merdeka and whether or not that world is better. To that extent then, Nevin said, but you are going to have one race that is more likely going to be predominant as opposed to the other. I am sorry, but that is status quo, where groups like, for example, Malays prioritize and feel as if what they need to protect right now is their identity. In a world in which we attempt to create a singular identity, you forego things like, for example, the prioritization of race. You forego things like, for example, creating one race that is more superior than the other. So your argument when it comes to one race is going to be superior in the formation is going to be untrue. However, I'm going to argue that even if that is true, that is still a better world than status quo in opposition's world. Second issue, whether or not you are going to have cultures that are going to predominate. Number one, I will contest that culture is oftentimes not stagnant. And I feel like cultures oftentimes evolve as a result of societies evolving. So for example, right, before this, and I'm going to say clearly, that we used to have, like Malays used to have things, for example, slaves in the past. We used to do things, for example, hijabs weren't necessarily a particularly strong thing, but rather as a result of Arabization, we started to wear hijabs and tried to predominantly follow that particular culture. Societies change as a result, cultures change as a result of societies changing. In a world in which you attempt to create a single identity, we say societies will then dictate what that particular culture looks like. The analysis then comes when the analysis then becomes when Umar told you about how things like, for example, vernacular schools are not likely to exist as a result of creating a singular identity. Political parties are less likely going to be racial by definition. Things like, for example, economic enfranchisement and economic areas are less likely going to be divided based on things like, for example, race. So you won't have things, for example, for example, the Malays living in kampongs or the Chinese living in cities and the Indians living in rubber tap areas as opposed to what has happened during the British times. These are all things that are going to be broken down. As a result of things, for example, forced integration and the necessity for you to do things, for example, communicate with other races as a result of you being in a singular area, we think the formation of that culture is going to be inclusive as a comparative in opposition where race is oftentimes within particular enclaves and you're unable to create interactions which are meaningful. The conclusion to this first issue is simple. No, thank you. That culture is more likely going to be created as a result, and you will have a new culture. Yes, I agree. We cannot tell you how this culture is going to look like in terms of its practices or how it looks like, but rather we can intuitively say you can create a new one that doesn't necessarily is present within status quo. Hence, let's evaluate this world versus the status quo in opposition side. Opposition suggested status quo is fine because enclaves creates autonomies. I'm sorry, but that is the reason as to why societies are divisive. Places like, for example, Shah Alam, which is predominantly Malays, have very little individuals who are of other races. Means that if you are born in Shah Alam, go to a school in Shah Alam, go to UiTM and have a job in Shah Alam, you're less likely going to interact with an individual who is Chinese or Indian throughout your lifetime, right? This is the reality that side opposition has to defend. Oftentimes, this festers hate as a result, because oftentimes you have things like, for example, political parties using race as a reason for you to unite and use that to galvanize power. When politicians say things like, for example, if you do not do this, the Malay race is going to be worse off. It's things like, for example, the Chinese are trying to get us at the end of the day. It's when Chinese politicians say, if you don't support us, the Malays are going to get you.
On that.
Like, in addition to that, right, the privileges that are created as a result of opposition's world oftentimes exaggerate this particular conflict. Why is this true? Because when you have a lot of benefits onto you, oftentimes other races have to collectivize as to what Prime Minister told you. The collectivization of other races oftentimes comes as a result of them feeling like I have to defend myself and I have to defend my own culture. That is when things, for example, companies are predominantly Malays or companies are predominantly Chinese. When you have to support your own culture and you have to support your own people, the enclave become worse. As a result, interactions don't exist within opposition's world, and oftentimes this festers hate as a result of politics being divisive on the basis of race. Sure.
I understand why a single identity has its benefits, but tell me why in Malaysia the minorities will be okay with trading that off.
So number one is that this motion assumes you prefer a world where it happens. Hence it means it's fiated within government side that in a world in which the formation happens, it is fine, but rather you must evaluate whether or not the outcome of that world is a comparatively better one. Hence, granted that that is the world in which opposition has to defend, why is our world then more preferable? Number one, in the absence of divisiveness of races, oftentimes the prioritization of things like, for example, politics is not to win political votes or not to win political votes based on race, but rather other things which are more objective. It's things like, for example, how do we make Malaysia as a united singular identity more flourishing in terms of economic prowess and whether or not we are able to help more individuals at the end of the day. It is not whether or not we can help one community versus another community or prioritization of one community over the other, but rather a prioritization of how we benefit a holistic sense and whether or not we are able to help most individuals at the end of the day. Even if the creation of this particular culture is predominantly taken by one instance, or one culture becomes the predominant one and then everyone has to follow, we say the comparative is better because you are unable to use things, for example, racism as a justification to divide individuals, and even if we have to follow and subset to ourselves to another higher culture, we think the benefits trickle down as a result. Ladies and gentlemen, the world in the comparative in opposition's world is a far worse world as a result of the creation of enclaves and the inability for you to interact as a result. Societies are better off in our, for all of those reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you, Hilmi, visibly functional Deputy Prime Minister. It's been a while. That comment has nothing to do with any government. I hope I'm not going to get in trouble for saying that. Next speaker on the opposition is Sharwin Muhammad Mohan. Oh, sorry, Danish Ram. I keep making mistakes on names. Yes, please welcome.
When we were ruled by the British government, Indians were segregated to the estate, Chinese were segregated to the businesses, and Malays were segregated to menial labor. When we gained independence, all of these things didn't change. The fact mattered was, even if you want to believe the world that government tries to frame, that everyone has the similar values, everyone has similar necessities, it is just not true at that point in time. How did we battle the British government for independence? How did we collectivize when we were so different? We did it because of the fact we were protected by our identity. The fact that everyone came together and united and said, Malaysia is for everyone and we will fix these problems. In a world where if you had achieved independence based on a national identity, it's impossible at that time to collectivize values and necessities and bring everyone together and say, forgo your identity, forgo your culture, forgo your religion, let's focus on what's best for everyone. When what's best for everyone was entirely different. That's why you had race-based parties. That's why Tun Sambatan and Tun Tanglekwok fought at different fronts of that time. And when we gained independence, we gained it on that basis that your identity is protected. That's why we protect it in the Constitution. If we accept government's model and rego all of the historical evidence behind it, we are disgracing our forefathers. We are disgracing the contributions of culture and different identities in what built Malaysia that it is today. We have problems, for sure, but we have problems that allows us to voice it out. In a world that can be wielded, as long as it's good for national agenda, I don't care. That is the world that I do not want to live in. And that's coming from an Indian, right? So let's talk about two things before I go into my argument. The first, nationalism. They have been very convenient in telling you what national identity will look like. It's not true. It means one dominant culture and race will get to pick what an identity looks like, and everyone else has to follow under. Why is this harmful in Malaysia? Because we are not America, we are not UK that has very small population of minorities. We are 40% strong in what it means to be someone who is not Malay Muslim. In that point in time, you ask these individuals to degrade culture and degrade identity. What would have been the response from them? I think you cannot figure this out. You must debate in the worst instance and why that is more preferable. I will go into the bigger harms later. Secondly, on this idea that political divisiveness won't occur if you have national identity. That is historically untrue. America basically has one national identity. Is there no political divisiveness between the Republicans and Democrats? Do we vote as Malaysians based on race, right? It's not true. We vote based on values. Individuals who are front on corruption, individuals who are front on bad things that harms us together, even though with our identities, we vote them out. So this idea must be proven that you will get no political divisiveness in response of trading off culture, right? I don't think so. You can say in the hopes of trading off political divisiveness without proving it, let's forget culture, let's forget identity. I think that trade-off is not something that they claim is successful. So going into my argumentation, first, why, but before that, sure.
Why can't we create a national identity revolving around anti-colonialism against the British?
Because at that point in time, everyone had different necessities, right? Anti-colonialism is not enough to collectivize so many individuals if independence come at the expense of them losing their identity. If I'm a Hindu and I've already lost my rights when British ruled me, why would I fight for Malaysia that tells me I can't be a Hindu anyway? That makes no sense to fight for, right? Going into degradation of democracy and fragility. First, why is democracy and our voices important? Only when you have identity, only when you are protected, you will voice out your faults. You will voice out your claims. Malaysia has protected this even in the event of us fighting. Why is this so valuable? Something that they needed to trade off. Because you look at Thailand, you look at Indonesia, any individual who doesn't conform to the value, they're immediately silenced. Even if it comes at the expense of peace, it comes at the expense of you not having a voice. That is a value that they must trade off. Why is this true? Because, sit down, national identity is based on several things. The first is economic policy or stability that they can provide for everyone. Given Malaysia's context that we cannot provide to everyone because everyone has different necessities, it means that the likeliness of you performing policy that can be enjoyed by everyone is highly unlikely. What does that mean? It means cultural identity is more important because as an Indian, as a poor individual or as a Chinese who doesn't have their government's backs, at least they can go and celebrate with their family in Chinese New Year. At least they can have an identity that they can fall back into. At least they have parties that will protect their rights in parliament. All of these things will cease to exist if you have a national identity, right? Why is this even worse when you make it bad? Given the fact that you cannot give everyone freedoms or you cannot give everyone opportunities to enjoy the economic policy and it's only enjoyed by the big majority, this means you will become Thailand or Indonesia in the way that you silence people's voices. You silence their opportunity to change their values. You silence the opportunity for culture to evolve because you don't want them to be angry. You don't want them to be sad. You want the majority to continuously have a say as to how policy is impacted, how policy is inflicted. All of these things means you silence the one thing that makes us all Malaysian, our ability to speak out. M can tell you that in our world we have individuals that individuals of different identities. The reason why that is an amazing mechanism is people cannot create policy without forgetting who we are. And do we have policies that are completely race-based? We have BRIM that gives to all those individuals who come from poverty. We have policies that impact everyone, right? I'm happy to give Bumiputras the ability to get land rights as long as my voice to speak out is protected. As long as my opportunity to practice my identity is seen as something of value because that's what my grandfather fought for. That's what my great-grandfather fought for. That's what everyone did when Malaysia was becoming independent. All of these things only bring to one conclusion that side opposition gave to you. In a world where you have created a national identity that would have been controlled by the majority, that is not valuable because the end goal or the end outcome is always to promote one identity. That identity, if it is controlled by the majority, means people like me who, even though I don't have India at the back of my IC, will still look black, will still look brown. I will still be forgotten. My voices still won't matter. I don't want to live in that world. I don't think anyone should. For those reasons, very proud to be on opposition.
Thank you, Danish. A clear and passionate national debater, and not many people are proud to be in the opposition nowadays. Let's invite the last substantive speaker on the government bench, the only non-Malaysian in this debate, Irtiza Ali Somro.
Can everyone hear me? This system of creating a national identity in a country where different races and religions exist has been applied before. I stand before you to share the example of my country. Following independence, Pakistan had I think like 7 to 8 major races, multiple different religions, and it was seen as a problem for the state going forward. What they did was they crafted the Pakistani identity to encompass everyone, to just mean people who belong to that land. And as a result of it, we didn't suffer the same racial riots Malaysia had in the 60s. We need to understand that their case was premised on 2 extremely problematic things. The first thing they said was they tried to tie down a group of harms, right? Like they said, backlash is going to apply, people are going to be resilient and want to protect their culture. Secondly, they said that politics is going to be one which encourages participation of minorities in status quo, according to them. So I'll have 2 things in my speech. Number 1, I'll tell you will the harm of the backlash they're trying to talk about actually apply as soon as this is passed. Secondly, I'll talk about the nature of politics and nationalism and why it's comparatively better under our side. Let's analyze the first. Will the harm of the backlash apply? They said that people will resist because culture is extremely important and people want to hold on to this with all their might. Sure, this is true. Culture does matter to people. What they had to do was tell us why a national identity does not somehow celebrate things like our culture as well. And I think that that easily can happen because you can define Malaysia as being, you can define the nationality or the identity of a Malay to not necessarily just be Muslim, just be people of one race. It can be literally anyone who belongs to this land. Meaning to say that that significantly takes away an extent of their harm. Secondly, you're forgetting that the need to want to fight back and protect and be extremely defensive exists a lot more in a world in which you homogenize people. And this is important. The process of homogenization was completely ignored under their side. What happens in status quo, the point in time in which you have multiple different identities, is that people group within those identities. And here's the thing, it's not enough to just tell me that, oh, I need my right to practice my religion and speak up. You also have to deal with the fact that there are multiple different harms that come as a result of Malays hanging out with Malays and Chinese people hanging out with only Chinese individuals. There's a plethora of harms that we explored. Number 1 is that when you're with your community, it is only natural that you otherize a different community. So people feel the need to be defensive and protective over what is their own. And they only see people that belong to their skin color and religion as their own. As a result of this, you have things like massive levels of otherization, discrimination, workplace politics that encourages things like hiring a certain race, etc. These are problems that exist within status quo that they had to deal with. It wasn't enough to simply just tell me that, like, religious celebrations are important, etc. Those are harms that also applied within status quo. But secondly, let's analyze the nature of politics and nationalism. They said that minorities are unlikely to be okay with it. They said that minorities are unlikely to be okay with it because this new identity is going to be one that is dominated by the majority. This is a tricky argument because it correctly assumes that Malays are naturally going to be the majority within the society. So they say that there's going to be a significant influence on their part in this identity. Let's assume this is necessarily true. But here's the cool thing about it, is that minority participation in the politics is still going to be a lot higher. Because even if the national identity is there's a greater influence over one group has a greater influence, note that the political parties that are likely to be formed in this in this world are still one that are not entirely race or religion based, which means that naturally minorities will feel more inclined to join that particular political party. You don't have political parties that only stand for Malays. You don't have political parties that only stand for Chinese. Rather, you have political parties that stand for Malaysia. In this world, it is much easier for a minority to want to join that political party. They said that they'll feel that there's no representation of their part. I think that, look, the need to want greater levels of representation is naturally less, because you already have people standing for you in that political party, because that party naturally represents all of Malaysia as opposed to just you. So you don't have parties that use us versus them mentalities and spread hate. You don't have parties that use things like use dirty narratives like, look, the Chinese are trying to take your jobs, the Indians are trying to take your jobs, etc., and you have to protect yourself. These narratives no longer exist in a world in which the parties have to cater to Malaysia as a whole. So the way in which politics works is that the direction that political parties are going to take, especially when it comes to elections and their policies, is how to best cater to Malaysia as opposed to how to best cater to that specific race. Yes.
Yes, you talked about otherization. A national identity that is built on framing other identities out will still create otherizations and minorities.
Okay, that assumes that that national identity is going to be premised entirely on one specific race. I think number one, you are yet to prove that. Number two, given that there are a significant part of this country, and as rightly proven, they were a significant part of independence, I think it's very likely that they're going to have some influence over the way in which this national identity is going to be shaped. Furthermore, note that just simply taking off things like your race from your IC makes a more neutral situation for most races, etc. But thirdly, on nationalism, on this national identity, right? They said that, look, everyone has different necessities. I don't think he explained this very well. What exactly are these different necessities that mean that people have to homogenize in their specific communities, people have to discriminate against one another, and people have to prioritize their religion and race over the other? I don't know what this necessity is that would justify all of these horrible things. In fact, right, let's talk about these different necessities. The first necessity is obviously economic empowerment. And it's true that minorities need this the most. And I think that it's far easier in a world in which you don't have race-based politics or a race-based identity. Because number one, if Malaysian identity is going to be crafted around everyone in the country, you're not going to have constitutional provisions that grant privileges to a certain race. Which means that naturally things like economic empowerment happen easier for minorities and other races, as opposed to trapping them in systemic poverty because one race is prioritized over the other. Secondly, note that they said that these are different necessities that existed during independence, hence why they must exist in enclaves. And he said the hate for the British is simply not enough to form a national identity for everyone. So apparently, being enslaved, being told that you are a second-class citizen, being told that you are never going to be capable of running a country just the way the British did to every single one of us and our grandparents in this room is not enough. I think that's extremely insulting, because that suggests that what they did wasn't all that bad to begin with. I think it was tremendously horrible, and that alone can build a beautiful identity for the future of Malaysia. Never been prouder to propose.
Thank you very much, Irtiza, and we love the fact that he's bringing in his Pakistani experience to the table. I mean, we're Malaysians, we're all about that diversity. Maybe if you start learning the national tongue, we can give you an IC as well. For the last substantive speech in this debate, I'd like to invite the third speaker from the opposition bench, Sharin Mohammed Mohan.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. I think it's quite funny that side government proposes to remove the Malay or the India or the China identity from the IC, and then suddenly Malays will start talking to Chinese people in Shah Alam. And then suddenly, like Indian people will start talking to Malays in Pahang, for example. The thing is, these differences were pre-existing. meaning Malays were concentrated in the Malay heartlands of Pahang, Kelantan, Terengganu. The Chinese people were concentrated in urban areas, for example, and the Indians were concentrated in areas that were more like agricultural, for example. So these differences already existed. Therefore, what would have been the best strategy for the coalition that wanted independence and wanted the formation of national identity, being Tunku Abdul Rahman and co? What was the best strategy for them to form the nation? The best strategy was to cater to the respective differences of each community and then reduce the differences of each race thereby. Meaning, the policy prescription for each race is different, and I'll tell you why. And the only way in which these policy prescriptions would have existed in Malaysia, which would have contributed to reducing interracial deprivation, is if you allowed Indians to form political parties that revolve only around their interests, Chinese people to form parties only around their interests, and then collectivize on a national platform, being Barisan Nasional. Because, like, don't abide their whole idea that, oh, in our world, all the races, or like the minority races, will be disenfranchised. Because that was not what happened, ladies and gentlemen. During the independence, Tunku Abdul Rahman respected the needs for each other race and took them onto the table and included their interest in the discussion when the constitution was formed, for example. And that's why the other races were okay with making concessions like giving Bumiputra rights to the Malays, for example. This is to pacify tensions and to allow for the reduction of interracial deprivation to happen before you can collectivize and form a post-racial Malaysia. Firstly, how does nationalism erode culture? Because they say that we can have nationalism, but then people can practice their own culture also. Let me tell you why nationalism, or the formation of national identity, will most likely erode the culture of minority races. Primarily because, firstly, if they want to prove that they can effectively form a national identity, they must prove to us the government must take drastic measures to form that singular identity. Because there'll be so many problems. It won't be like fine and dandy, like today we we ban race-based parties from existing, tomorrow everyone will just identify as Malaysians. No, that is not what will happen. What will happen instead is you will receive backlash, as rightfully pointed out by Irtiza, for example. So when this happens, the government will take extra measures to suppress this backlash. This looks like creation of a singular language and reducing funding for programs for ethnic-based languages, for example. This looks like no vernacular schools. This looks like disincentivizing minority cultures from preserving their own culture, for example. Secondly, this looks like no thank you, I'll take you at 6. This looks like culture and tradition, for example, being heavily tied to religion. Meaning, you would want a government to be more secular. You would want either secular or one official religion. In both circumstances, you also suppress the ones of minority religions. And when you have one official religion, which is Islam, that's also when you oppress or suppress the support for minority religions. So nationalism does indeed erode culture. Secondly, let's talk about independence. Which side best accrues or best achieves independence, or a form of independence that is palatable to all communities? Primarily because Ram told you that the problems were unique to each race. Let me tell you what the specific problems were. So Malays, for example, had the highest poverty rate in Malaysia in comparison to other races, and the lowest participation in the civil sector in the 1950s. Secondly, Chinese people, for example, had more businesses and lower influence in the civil sector. And thirdly, the Indians were primarily concentrated around agricultural areas. Their problems were mainly infrastructural, for example. How does policy prescription improve on our side? When you have race-based parties, that's when you have politicians that cater to the individual or specific needs of these communities. That's when the incentive to fight for the individual needs of these communities will be stronger, because self-interest is stronger than a national interest, which will dilute the policy prescriptions required for the solutions that are to be delivered to these communities. Secondly, they tell us that the reason why it will be more successful is because Malays, Chinese, and Indians will be motivated by the purpose of anti-colonialism. But we will tell you that the Malays will more likely dominate the discussion, primarily because they were already working in the civil sector. They were closer to the powers and the rings of governance, for example, and they're more likely to dominate political capital, on top of the fact that they were the majority. But what happened in our world was Tunku Abdul Rahman and co. respected other cultures and wanted to include the different interests, and this allowed for the preservation of language and culture. That is how you get economic empowerment for the Indians. When MIC fought for more government transfers, for more payments, for more like easier loans for a lot of Indian people to get when they moved out of the agricultural areas and when they moved out of the rubber estates. That is when their interests would have been more pronounced in national discussion. But before that, yeah.
Okay, so your justification for not changing things is because these were pre-existing conditions. Just because something is broken doesn't mean you don't fix it. Why would you entrench that situation and encourage a future of dirty race-based politics?
Okay, so let's talk about race-based politics. Because firstly, it's not as bad as you think. Firstly, it's not as bad as you think. It only happens in rural areas. There's ability to progress. Secondly, it's not mutually exclusive because they never explained to us why the feudal leaders in the rural areas will suddenly refrain from talking about their own race when you don't have race-based parties, right? Thirdly, race-based politics is more likely to be moderate in our world. Why? Because when you make something a taboo, people will internalize it and it manifests in more pernicious forms. So things like white nationalism in the United States, Hungary, and Germany were a result of having a too strong national identity that seeks to be more inclusive to other races. That's when you have hate crimes against minorities rise. How do you create a post-racial society? When you want a society to no longer take race into account, that is when you must make sure, firstly, that interracial differences reduce, and this will only happen through race-based parties that prioritize the interests of their own race. But secondly, prejudice and racism is scrutinized in legitimate discourse, and legitimate discourse over race will only happen in our world when race is an important determinant in how elections turn out. The Malaysia I want is about cultural diversity. The fact that I get to go and see the huge Blue Mosque in Shah Alam, the Kek Lok Si in Penang, and the huge Murugan statue in the Batu Caves. It's about being able to witness religious festivals, practice in the highest form of authenticity. And a system that intends to diminish this authenticity and diversity diminishes Malaysia. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Sharwin. I love his calm and killing speaking style. He reminds me somewhat of Malaysia's Prime Minister, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad. I'll leave that there. Now that concludes the 6 substantive speeches we have today. Let's give them a round of applause. Next, we'll start with a summary of the reply speeches. And to start the reply speech, I'd like to invite the speaker from the opposition bench.
Let's talk about nationalism and what it can achieve. Today, I wear a batik shirt, and let's say, in their policy, a Malay individual wears a batik shirt too. When we go out, are we equal? That is the question. That is what that they want to prove is to be true. I think logically speaking, the fact that I am different in color, the fact that I have an accent, the fact that I grew up with different lifestyle and environment because of the segregation policies that happened pre-independence means that I will never be looked at as an equal individual despite the fact that both of us are indescribable in terms of pair of clothing or in terms of the fact that we are both Malaysian. This is the crux of Syed's government case. The fact that they cannot prove equality will occur is the reason why they cannot take the debate. But even more so, what is the way that we prove it cannot happen specifically in Malaysia? Because if you notice, the generic arguments that come from government about culture, every culture can evolve A. B, everyone can contribute culture. That's untrue. Malays, Chinese, and Muslims have completely different cultures that cannot coagulate with one another to form a singular identity. I don't eat beef. Chinese people eat both. Malay people don't eat pork. How are you going to coagulate these cultures? The fact that we have different faith systems, the fact that our places of worship look completely different with one another. So the first thing we established was culture cannot be coagulated. So this means under their model, cultures will have to be framed out. Secondly, what did we prove? We proved that culture is identity for Malaysians for 2 reasons. Historical context shows us because we have been segregated, we formed our cultures, we formed our identities, we formed our response to oppression, to suppression, to the ideas of us not being able to have free will and free speech under British rule. This was our response at that point in time. And we are very proud of it, the fact that we can speak different languages as an Indian. The fact that I can go to temple and not be looked at as some weirdo. These are things that are the reasons why we fought against the British individuals, because they diminished our opportunities to have this. Irtiza cannot say that we only fight against the British people because they have enslaved us. No, they also took our opportunities to celebrate our identity, which is exactly what government is doing now. Tell me, why will that be a Malaysia that will be better than what it is today, right? But let's look at their best case. Best case is people understand that nationalism is important, that peace is valuable, that people forgo their culture, that people forgo their traditions, people forgo their celebrations, people become peaceful. People understand the fact that nuances don't matter, and as a minority, the greater good of nationalism is better. Why is it opposition still take the debate? Because we don't want that. We want our ability to be free, to have voices, to have an identity that clashes with the majority, that clashes with the Malays and Muslims. Because that is a representation that I am valued, that I am here, that I stand here and you listen to me. That is what matters most as a Malaysian, right? Your ability to have those things. Sure, some races have Bumiputra rights, some races have these rights, some races have those rights. But when it boils down to the most important ability to communicate your problems, to communicate the fact that you have been oppressed, no country listens better than Malaysia. That's why we changed, came in the last election. That's why we have the opportunity to create power among ourselves. These are things that will naturally be annexed under that government, and they never gave a response as to why our democracy will be diminished when you entreat culture. Because the logical conclusion, if a nation can take away your identity in the hope that what's best for the country, why can't they take your voice? Why can't they take your will? All of these things are not worth the trade-off of peace, especially since, are we rioting every day? No, we're not. The last major riots we had was 30 years ago. We have grown and progressed based on the ideologies of love, understanding, and tolerance. These are things that I will happily keep so that I can keep standing here and have a voice and proudly say, I'm Indian. Thanks.
Thank you to the opposition team for the reply speech. And to conclude this debate, I'd like to invite a member of the government bench to deliver the reply speech, the final speech in this debate.
Hello. This debate prioritizes what version of the world is more preferable. Yes, I can agree that opposition has a world where you have some minimal capacity for minority races to voice out. But notice, zero responses as to how. Politics is oftentimes divisive. Politics oftentimes is hierarchical, and politics oftentimes centralize powers into specific parties as opposed to some semblance of unity at the end of the day, proves that the extent of the benefit of your ability to voice out is that you can only make noise but no change at all. The debate is this. Firstly, whether or not you have a national identity that is inclusive. I feel like opposition was ignorant to the analysis that came straight from Prime Minister. Number one, that in a world in which we attempt to do things like, for example, a singular identity, things like crossbreeding and the ability for interracial marriages are oftentimes more likely as a result because you don't view them as different. It's things like, for example, breaking things like vernacular schools where our kids can finally have Indians and Chinese friends. When I grew up, I only had one Chinese friend, no Indian friends, and I went to a Malay boarding school. I only had non-Malay friends when I finally entered varsity and joined debating. Look at the reality of most individuals when they have separated schools at the end of the day. Number two, even if you believe, as the panel, that there will be a singular identity where you have to frame out other identities, you must evaluate whether or not this world is comparatively better than a world with multiculturalism in opposition side. We say, and we told you, that a world where even if some races are framed out, the comparative is in government. You remove the excuse of racism to do things, for example, not give you jobs. You remove the excuse of things like, for example, tokenistic policies. So yes, some minorities get BRIM, but that's very tokenistic as opposed to the large-scale discrimination that exists on a comparative. We say things like, for example, you remove the toxicity of race-based politics that oftentimes divides even more than it is unite. Because in order for racial politicians to get things like, for example, power, votes, and support, you must fearmonger that other groups are going to get you. You're going to fearmonger that other races are out to get you and that they're an enemy to you, that they're different. We say we prefer this world where you remove all of that, as opposed to what? Where if you compare to opposition side, right? They told you, number one, you have the ability to voice out. But I told you in my preamble why that is the fullest extent to your capacity. Number two, active segregation to things like, for example, the creation of enclaves that are more likely going to be created in opposition's world, and the lack of interactions. Yes, you can preserve culture, but the expense of that preservation of culture comes at the expense of structural things that you can't necessarily change. Like, for example, jobs are more likely going to be predominantly existing for a specific race. It's things like, for example, land that's more likely going to be exclusive to a particular group at the end of the day. The lives of individuals are worse off in opposition, and we even contested that the racial riots that existed within the 60s and the death of Adib was predominantly because we otherize other groups. When there is a manifesting of hate, and the festering of that hate oftentimes exaggerates as the result of enclaves that opposition wanted to defend. This is a worse off world because most minorities are more likely going to be left out in the larger scale of the economy. We say this is a worse off world. Lastly, in the evaluation of this debate, a world with a singular identity is more likely unifying as a result of our necessity to interact, of our inability to use race as an excuse to otherize, as a result of interactions from the very small level, like schools, until up to the economic level, where you have to do things, for example, businesses with other groups. This is a more preferable world as opposed to one where you divide. For all of those reasons, this is the Malaysia I want.
Thank you very much, Hilmi Yazid, for the reply speech, and that concludes the entire debate today. The motion that was debated was this House prefers a Malaysia with a singular national identity as opposed to a multicultural identity. Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause to the debaters today, please. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, back to the MCs, Mashita and Aiman.
Ladies and gentlemen, how was it? I believe it was indeed an amazing debate we have seen just now. Thank you to the honorable adjudicators, speaker, timekeeper, and debaters.
I would like to invite Mr. Speaker and debaters to take their seats.
Hello everyone, can you guys hear me? So today I'm going to sing Someone You Love. Can we sing together? Yeah. I'm going under, and this time I fear there's no one to save me. This all or nothing really got a way of driving me crazy. I need somebody to heal, somebody to know, somebody to have, somebody to hold. It's easy to say, it's never the same. I guess I kinda love the way you numb all the pain. Now the day bleeds into nightfall, and you're not here to get me through it all. I let my guard down, and then you pull the rug. I was getting kinda used to being someone you love. I'm going under, and this time I fear there's no one to turn to. This all or nothing way of loving got me sleeping without you. I need somebody to know, somebody to heal, somebody to to know how to feel. It's easy to say, but it's never the same. I guess I kinda love the way you help me escape. Now the day bleeds into nightfall, and you're not here to get me through it all. I let my guard down, and then you pull the rug. I was getting kinda used to being someone you love, and I tend to close my eyes when it hurts. Sometimes I fall into your arms. I'll be sitting this out till I come back around. So now the day bleeds into nightfall, and you're not here to get me through it all. I let my guard down, and then you pull the rug. I was getting kinda used to being someone you love, and then the night bleeds into your fall, and you're not here to get me through it all. I let my guard down, and then you pull the rug. I was getting kinda used to being someone you love. I let my guard down, and then you pull the rug. I was getting kinda used to being someone you love. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, let's proceed with the prize giving session. We would like to invite the Honorable Associate Professor Dr. Zulkifli Hassan, Chairman of Majlis Debat University Malaysia, Madum, to deliver the prize to the recipients, accompanied by the Honorable Professor in Senior Technologies, Dr. Haji Rizwan Kamaruddin, Deputy Vice Chancellor of Academic and International, UNIMAP. Please. As a token of appreciation, we would like to call upon our honorable adjudicators. Please, Albert Kamalendra, Farhan Shah, Edwin Tan, please, Albert Kamalendra. Next, Farhan Shah. Edwin Tan. Next, Lim Tai Ji. And please, Amy Suhana.
Now, members of the hall, we will start with semi-finalists for English debate category. The recipients will receive 2,000 cash, trophy and certificates. I would like to call upon debate team from semi-finalist English debate category from University Sains Islam Malaysia, USIM. And University Technology Mara, UITM.
Next, we would like to call upon semi-finalists for Malay debate category. The recipients also will receive 2,000 cash, trophy and certificates. The debate team are from Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia, UKM. And I would like to call upon the debate team from University Technology Petronas, UTP.
Fellow audiences, we proceed with the best debater for both categories.
The recipient will receive 1,000 cash, trophy and certificates.
For English debate category, joint best debater goes to Umay Marshita binti Muhammad Azhar, UIA,
and Zazwan Daud from UITM. Malay debate category, the best debater goes to Muhammad Wafi Anwar.
Congratulations to all. Hopefully, this will be an inspiration for all of you to achieve more in future undertakings.
Now, we would like to invite all the guests of honor for the photography session. Please.
Thank you to all. Ladies and gentlemen, let's rise together to sing the Semangat Unimap song.